For 12 years, Christmas in Germany wasn't just a holiday. It was a performance, a grand, state-managed spectacle of national strength and ideological purity. The ancient traditions of Weihnachten were twisted, reshaped to fit a new, dark mythology. The star on the tree was replaced by a swastika. Silent Night was sung by legions who would bring anything but peace. The Nazis had tried to erase the Christian meaning of Christmas entirely, replacing it with their own pagan festival called Julfest. They spoke of the winter solstice, of ancient Germanic gods, of the eternal struggle of the Aryan race. Children were taught to sing not of the Christ child, but of the Führer. Christmas cookies were baked in the shape of swastikas and iron crosses. The nativity scene was replaced by images of blonde-haired, blue-eyed families gathered around the hearth, celebrating their racial purity. They believed they were a master race, destined to rule for 1,000 years. In December 1944, even as Allied bombs fell on German cities night after night, even as the Eastern Front collapsed and the Red Army advanced relentlessly westward, the propaganda machine insisted that victory was still within reach. Secret wonder weapons would turn the tide. The will of the German people would prove unbreakable. They celebrated Christmas 1944 convinced that secret weapons and unwavering will would still, somehow, deliver the final victory they had been promised. They were wrong. This was Christmas 1945, the first Christmas of the defeated. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted just 12. And in its wake it left a ghost of a country. A nation of 70 million people now living in what was called stunned null zero hour. The moment when everything stopped. When the past was obliterated, and the future was a terrifying blank page. An estimated 500 million cubic meters of rubble-choked German cities. In Berlin alone, there was enough debris to build a wall 100 feet wide and 100 feet high, stretching all the way from Berlin to Frankfurt, a distance of over 300 miles. Entire neighborhoods had been erased from the map. Streets that had stood for centuries were now unrecognizable canyons of broken stone and twisted metal. The smell of death still lingered in the air, seeping from collapsed buildings where bodies remained buried, uncounted and unmourned. Millions were homeless, living in cellars, bombed-out basements, or makeshift shelters cobbled together from sheets of corrugated metal and salvaged doors. Families of 5 or 6 huddled together in single rooms, sharing a single blanket, burning whatever they could find for warmth, furniture, books, even their own floorboards. Millions more were refugees, expelled from former German territories in the east by the advancing Soviet forces and the newly redrawn borders. They arrived in the western zones with nothing but the clothes on their backs, traumatized by journeys that had taken weeks or months, during which many had died of cold, hunger, or violence. The demographic catastrophe was staggering. An entire generation of men had been swallowed by the war. Over 5 million German soldiers were dead. Another 2 million were missing, their fates unknown, lost in the vast expanses of Russia, buried in unmarked graves, or languishing in Soviet prison camps from which few would ever return. For every 10 men who had marched off to war, only 6 or 7 came back. And those who did return were often broken, physically maimed, psychologically shattered, unable to recognize the world they had left behind or the people they had once been. A British soldier, writing home from Berlin in December 1945, described what he saw. He wrote, "Today is Christmas Sunday. 4 years ago I spent the day in hospital in Wales. 1 year ago I spent it in anxiety as rocket bombs exploded around me in Antwerp. This year I spend it in a sickroom bed in Berlin. Of all the people I know in this wretched war who has suffered most, it is the women of Germany. No matter where I have traveled, Wilhelmshaven, Bremen, Brunswick, or Berlin, theirs is the haunting look, a look of hopelessness, degradation, and humiliation. They have one hope and consolation, their children. Their men are no more. They have been swallowed up by those gigantic battles we so often refused to believe took place in Russia. In this landscape of ghosts, the ghost of Christmas was the most haunting of all. How could you celebrate peace on earth when your world had been obliterated by war? How could you sing of joy when your heart was filled with grief? How could you give thanks when you had nothing to be thankful for? And as the bitter cold of the first post-war winter began to bite, as snow fell on the ruins and the temperature dropped below freezing, one question rose above all others: what, if anything, would be under the Christmas tree in 1945? Before there could be any thought of presents, before there could be any consideration of celebration, there was the all-consuming, desperate, daily reality of hunger. The winter of 1945 to 46 would go down in German memory as the hunger winter, the hunger winter. The nation's infrastructure was shattered. The railway system, once the pride of German engineering, was a twisted wreck. Bridges had been blown up. Stations had been bombed into oblivion. Food distribution, which had been centrally controlled and relatively efficient even during the war years, had completely collapsed. The official ration system, a meager lifeline, was failing. The ration cards that every German carried were supposed to guarantee survival. But the promise printed on those cards was often as empty as the shelves in the distribution centers. The official promise was a daily intake of between 1,000 and 1,500 calories, roughly half of what a healthy adult needs to function, and far less than what was needed for the backbreaking labor of clearing rubble and rebuilding a shattered nation. But even this starvation-level ration was theoretical. In practice, the food often simply wasn't there. The winter of 1945 to 46 was exceptionally cold, one of the harshest in decades. Rivers and canals froze solid, paralyzing the barges that were supposed to carry coal from the Ruhr Valley and food from the countryside into the starving cities. The harvest of 1945 had been poor. Fields had been left unplanted or untended during the chaotic final months of the war, and there were not enough men or horses to work the land. What little food there was had to be divided among a population swollen by millions of refugees. The traditional Christmas feast, roast goose, red cabbage, potato dumplings, stolen marzipan, was not just out of reach. It was a cruel fantasy, a memory from another lifetime. For most Germans, Christmas 1945 was the turnip winter. The turnip, the humble, unglamorous turnip, became the symbol of survival and of misery. People ate turnips for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They tried to make them into everything: turnip bread, turnip coffee, turnip cutlets, turnip soup. Housewives traded recipes for making turnips more palatable, though there was only so much you could do. It provided bulk, a feeling of fullness, but very little real nutrition. The psychological effect of this monotony, this endless, joyless consumption of the same tasteless vegetable, was devastating. It was especially cruel during a season that was supposed to be about feasting, about abundance, about the warmth and richness of home. Children, who had never known peacetime plenty, grew thin and listless. Rickets and scurvy, diseases of malnutrition, became common. Elderly people, their bodies unable to cope with the cold and the hunger, simply gave up. They would go to sleep one night and not wake up. The official death toll from starvation and cold-related illnesses that winter was in the tens of thousands. The true number was almost certainly higher, as many deaths went unrecorded in the chaos. Where official channels failed, a new, ruthless, and utterly immoral economy thrived. The black market, in the shadows of the ruined cities, in back alleys and bombed-out basements, a vast underground network of traders, smugglers, and desperate people operated beyond the reach of law or morality. Here, anything was available for a price few could afford. In Berlin, in December 1945, the black market prices were staggering, almost obscene in their disproportion to the official economy. A single pound of butter cost 25 pounds sterling, over $1,200 in today's money. A rabbit, which might feed a family for one meal, cost 12 pounds. A pound of coffee, that pre-war symbol of middle-class comfort, cost 50 pounds. A hundredweight of potatoes, enough to last a family a few weeks, could be had for 4 pounds or, more commonly, for 30 American cigarettes. Cigarettes had become the most reliable currency in post-war Germany, more trusted than the rapidly inflating Reichsmark. A single American Lucky Strike or Camel cigarette could buy a loaf of bread. A carton of cigarettes could buy almost anything: food, clothing, jewelry, even sexual favors. Allied soldiers, who received cigarettes as part of their rations, found themselves suddenly wealthy in this bizarre new economy. Some took advantage, trading their cigarettes for valuable antiques. cameras, or watches. Others, more compassionate, simply gave them away to hungry children or desperate mothers. For the price of a single pound of butter on the black market, an ordinary German worker might have to toil for months. It was a world of impossible, soul-destroying choices. Do you burn your furniture to stay warm for a week? Or trade it for a Christmas goose that will be gone in an hour? Do you keep your mother's locket, the last tangible connection to a happier past? Or trade it for medicine for a sick child? Do you sell your wedding ring, the symbol of a love that has endured through war and loss, for a bag of flour? One German father, a former schoolteacher, recorded his journey in his diary. His words capture the quiet desperation and the stubborn dignity of those who refused to give up. He wrote, December 23, 1945. I walked 20 kilometers today to the countryside. My feet are numb, but my heart is not. I brought with me my most prized possession, a first edition of Goethe's poetry, a gift from my own father when I graduated from university. I found Herr Schmidt, the farmer. He remembered me from before the war, when I had tutored his eldest son in Latin. He took the book in his rough, work-worn hands and turned the pages carefully, as if it were made of glass. He said poetry would not fill his children's bellies, but it might warm their souls. He gave me 6 eggs, 6 perfect, beautiful eggs. For a moment, holding them in my hands, feeling their smooth, fragile shells, I felt like the richest man in Germany. Tomorrow, for Christmas, my children will have a taste of a world that is lost. They will have eggs. The Allied occupation forces were not blind to the suffering. They saw it every day, the hollow-eyed children, the skeletal women, the men who looked decades older than their years. But they were caught in a terrible, almost impossible dilemma. They had to feed their own troops, who numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They had to prevent mass starvation, which would lead to disease, unrest, and chaos. And they had to begin the process of denazification, of dismantling the structures of the regime that had caused so much suffering, all while dealing with a population that was exhausted, traumatized, and often resentful of their new masters. It was a drop in an ocean of need, a single candle against an overwhelming darkness. But for a people who had lost everything, who had been reduced to the most basic struggle for survival, this tiny flicker of organized compassion was a start. It was a reminder that humanity had not been entirely extinguished. Yet, as parents looked at their hungry children, as they felt the cold seeping through the walls of their makeshift shelters, they knew that a Punch and Judy show couldn't fill an empty stomach. A free cinema ticket couldn't keep you warm. The real magic of Christmas, if there was to be any magic at all, would have to be made with their own hands, born not of abundance, but of memory, ingenuity, and love. For a German child in 1945, the first sign of Christmas wasn't the lights in a shop window, because there were no lights and the shop windows were shattered. It wasn't the smell of baking cookies, because there was no butter, no sugar, no flour for such luxuries. The first sign of Christmas was the sudden, secret appearance of a Christmas tree, a Tannenbaum. But even this, the most central, the most beloved symbol of a German Christmas, was a forbidden luxury. The forests surrounding German cities were now controlled by the Allied occupation authorities. Every tree, every branch was accounted for. Timber was desperately needed for reconstruction, for fuel, for 100 different purposes. To cut down a tree without permission was an illegal act, punishable by fines or even imprisonment. Only those with special certificates, families with many children, or those officially recognized as victims of fascism, people who had been persecuted by the Nazi regime, were allowed to obtain a tree legally. Ruth Andreas Friedrich, a Berlin journalist and a member of the anti-Nazi resistance, wrote in her diary on December 21, 1946, capturing the absurdity and the quiet defiance of the situation. She wrote, "What do you think of a Christmas tree? Frank asked me this morning. A lot," I said, "but unfortunately there aren't any, unless you have a certificate that proves you have lots of children or were a victim of fascism." Frank laughed. "Or if you have a saw." And so, all across Germany, in the dead of night, fathers and sons ventured into the forbidden forests. They moved quietly, nervously, like criminals, because that is what they were. They carried small, rusty saws hidden under their coats. They looked over their shoulders, listening for the sound of a patrol. When they found a suitable tree, not too large, nothing that would be missed, they worked quickly, the rhythmic sound of the saw cutting through the cold night air. They weren't just cutting down a tree. They were reclaiming a piece of their identity, a symbol of normalcy in a world gone mad. They were telling themselves and their children that despite everything, despite the defeat and the occupation and the hunger, they were still German. They still had their traditions. They still had Christmas. Getting the tree home was its own adventure. They couldn't simply walk through the streets carrying it openly. They had to hide it, drag it through back alleys, cover it with blankets or old coats. If they were caught, the tree would be confiscated, and they would face punishment. But the risk was worth it, because when they finally got the tree home, when they set it up in their cold, bare room, it transformed the space. It was no longer just a ruin. It was a home. It was Christmas. They made strings of dried apple rings, painstakingly sliced and hung to dry for weeks. They carved small figures from scraps of wood, angels, stars, little animals, using nothing more than a pocket knife and patience. Children folded paper stars from old newspapers. The black and white print of yesterday's ration announcements transformed into something beautiful. Families who had managed to save a single, cherished glass ornament from before the war would hang it in the place of honor, a fragile link to a lost world of plenty. The tree was lit not with electric lights, which required electricity that was rationed and unreliable, but with real candles. Small stubs of wax, hoarded and saved, were carefully attached to the branches. Lighting the tree was a moment of profound, almost sacred significance. The family would gather, the candles would be lit one by one, and for a few precious moments, the room would be filled with a warm, golden glow. It was magic. It was hope. It was Christmas. If the tree was a symbol of hope, the presents beneath it were monuments to love. The age of mass-produced toys, of department stores filled with dolls and trains and teddy bears, was over. The lavish gifts of the Nazi era, when the state had encouraged families to have many children and had rewarded them with subsidies and gifts, were a bitter memory. In 1945, a gift was not something you bought. It was something you made. And in the making of it, you poured every ounce of your love, your hope, your determination that your family would survive. Mothers stitched dolls from old potato sacks, the rough burlap softened by hours of handling. They used threads pulled from worn-out uniforms, the gray-green of the Wehrmacht, the brown of the Hitler Youth, to create hair. Buttons from old coats became eyes. A scrap of faded fabric became a dress. These dolls were not beautiful by any conventional standard. They were lumpy, uneven, crude, but they were made with love, and to the child who received one, they were priceless. Grandfathers, their hands gnarled by age and hard labor, carved small wooden horses, trains, or boats. They worked by candlelight, their fingers moving with the practiced care of men who had learned their craft in a different era. The wood was often scrap, a piece of a broken chair, a plank salvaged from the rubble. The tools were old, dull, barely functional. But the result was a toy that would be treasured, played with until it fell apart, and remembered for a lifetime. Older sisters knitted mittens or scarves from unraveled wool. They would take an old, moth-eaten sweater, carefully unpick the seams, and wind the yarn into balls. The yarn was lumpy, uneven, full of knots, but it was warm. And warmth that winter was the most precious gift of all. One woman, now elderly, her voice still thick with emotion after more than 7 decades, remembers her Christmas in 1945. She was 7 years old, living in the ruins of Hamburg with her mother and younger brother. Her father was missing, last seen on the Eastern Front. She says, "I remember the bombing. I remember the running, always running to the shelters. I remember the night our house was hit and we had to dig ourselves out of the rubble. For Christmas, I didn't dare to wish for anything. To be warm was the wish. To not be hungry was the wish. I didn't believe in miracles anymore. On Christmas Eve, my mother called us to her. She had been working on something in secret for weeks, hiding it from us. She gave me a doll. She had made it from a potato sack. Its eyes were buttons from her old coat. Its dress was made from a piece of her own skirt. I knew what it had cost her. The sleepless nights, sitting in the cold, her fingers raw and bleeding from pushing the needle through the rough fabric. It was the most beautiful doll in the world. It was proof that even in the rubble we were still a family, that she still loved me, that we would survive. I still have that doll. I will never let it go. But there was another, unexpected source of Christmas magic that year. It came from the most unlikely place imaginable. It came from the enemy. For German children, who had been taught for years to hate and fear Americans, who had been told that the Allies were monsters who would kill them or enslave them, this was a moment of profound, bewildering cognitive dissonance. An American soldier, a young GI from Iowa, no older than 20, wrote home to his mother in December 1945. His letter captures the strange, uncomfortable mixture of pity, compassion, and confusion that many Allied soldiers felt. He wrote, "Dear Mom, you should see their faces. These kids, they look at you like you're from another planet. They stare at a chocolate bar like it's a bar of gold. Some of them have never tasted chocolate. Can you believe that? Pockets which a year ago were crammed with grenades for killing us are now filled with the candy we give them. I don't know what to make of it all. They're just kids. They didn't start this war. It's Christmas, I guess. So we give them what we can." In Berlin, the city administration, working with the Allied authorities, organized a Christmas party for war orphans. Thousands of children, many of them living in overcrowded orphanages or on the streets, were invited. A man dressed as Santa Claus, or rather, as the German Weihnachtsmann, met a long line of children. There were no grand promises. He couldn't give them the one thing they truly wanted: their parents back, their homes restored, their old lives returned. But he could give them a small toy, a cookie, a piece of warmer clothing. A moment of kindness in a world that had shown them mostly cruelty. One woman who was an orphan that Christmas, who had lost both her parents in the bombing of Dresden, remembers the day with a clarity that defies the passage of time. She says, "I can remember it was the nicest Christmas we ever had. The American soldiers came to our orphanage. They brought boxes and boxes of things. Chocolate, oranges. I had never seen an orange before. They gave us toys, little cars, dolls, balls. They smiled at us. They didn't speak German and we didn't speak English, but it didn't matter. They gave us a Christmas to remember. From bombs to baby dolls, it was a miracle. It was the day I stopped being afraid of them. It was the day I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would get better." What was under the tree in 1945? A carved piece of wood, rough and unpolished, but made with a grandfather's love. A doll made from a potato sack, its button eyes reflecting the candlelight. A pair of mittens, lumpy and uneven, but warm. A single precious orange from a soldier who was far from his own home, missing his own family, but who chose to share what little he had. These weren't just gifts. They were gestures of defiance against despair. They were declarations that even amidst the ruins, the hunger, the grief, and the overwhelming darkness, the spirit of Christmas, the spirit of giving, of hope, of stubborn, irrational love, could not be extinguished. But while some Germans searched for hope in the rubble, while children marveled at handmade dolls and American chocolate, others faced a final, terrible reckoning. In Nuremberg, in the same city where Hitler had once staged his massive rallies, where hundreds of thousands had chanted his name and raised their arms in salute, the architects of the Thousand-Year Reich were on trial for their lives. And for them, Christmas 1945 would be unlike any other. It would be their last. Hermann Göring, once the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, the commander of the Luftwaffe, a man who had lived in obscene luxury even as his country burned, was now a shadow of his former self. He had been forced to undergo withdrawal from his morphine addiction. He had lost weight. His face, once bloated and jovial, was now drawn and gray. But his defiance, his arrogance, had not entirely left him. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, the man who had kept the German war machine running even as defeat became inevitable, sat quietly, his face a mask of calculation. He was already planning his defense, positioning himself as the good Nazi, the one who had been deceived, who had not known the full extent of the horrors. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, looked hollowed out, a man who had realized too late that his loyalty to Hitler had led him not to glory, but to the gallows. On Christmas Eve, a Protestant chaplain was allowed to offer a religious service to a dozen of the highest-ranking Nazi prisoners. They were crammed into a small, cold cell. There was no tree, no decorations, no warmth. Just the gray stone walls, the barred windows, and the grim faces of men who knew their fate. A reporter from the Washington Post, one of the few journalists allowed to observe, noted every detail of the scene with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. The chaplain began the service. He spoke of redemption, of forgiveness, of the mercy of God. Whether any of the men listening believed his words, or whether they were simply going through the motions, is impossible to know. Then he invited them to sing. The hymns they chose were the traditional German Christmas carols, the same songs that were being sung in homes and churches across Germany. O Tannenbaum, O Christmas tree, O du Fröhlich, oh how joyfully. And then, the most famous German carol of all, the one that had been sung for over a century, the one that had been translated into dozens of languages and had become a symbol of peace around the world. Still Nacht, Silent Night. The reporter noted that Hermann Göring's voice was especially loud. He sang with his eyes closed, his face tilted upward, as if he were performing for an invisible audience. Was it piety? Was it a genuine moment of reflection on the life he had lived and the crimes he had committed? Or was it the ultimate performance of a master manipulator? A man who had spent his entire life playing roles, trying one last time to appear human, to evoke sympathy? The scene is one of the most surreal, one of the most darkly ironic moments of the entire post-war period. These men, who were responsible for the deaths of millions, for the Holocaust, for the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, for the invasion of peaceful nations, for plunging the world into the most destructive war in human history, were singing a hymn about heavenly peace. The words echoed off the cold stone walls. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. But there was no calm, there was no peace. Not for them, not for the millions they had killed, not for the world they had destroyed. What was going through their minds as they sang? Were they thinking of their own families, of Christmases past when they had been powerful and untouchable? Were they thinking of the children they would never see again, the wives who had disowned them or been arrested alongside them? Or were they simply going through the motions, singing the words out of habit, out of a desperate need to cling to some shred of normalcy in the face of their impending doom? We will never know. But the irony, the bitter, crushing irony, is staggering. As the final notes of Silent Night faded away, as the chaplain offered a closing prayer, there could have been little doubt in any of their minds. This would be their last Christmas on Earth. The trial was ongoing. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The world was watching. Justice, delayed for so long, was finally coming. 10 months later, on October 15, 1946, Hermann Göring would cheat the hangman. Just hours before his scheduled execution, he swallowed a cyanide capsule that he had somehow managed to hide from his guards. He died in his cell on his own terms, denying the world the satisfaction of seeing him hang. The others, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, and 7 more, would meet their end at the gallows in the gymnasium of the Nuremberg prison. Their bodies were cremated, and their ashes were scattered in a river, so that there would be no grave, no shrine, no place for future Nazis to gather and remember them. The heavenly peace they sang of that Christmas Eve was not for them. It never would be. The story of Christmas 1945 is a story of contrasts, of darkness and light, of despair and a stubborn, almost irrational hope. It was a Christmas of empty plates, but also of shared crusts of bread. A Christmas of forbidden trees, but also of handmade gifts that carried more love than any store-bought toy ever could. A Christmas of silent nights, and of quiet, heartfelt carols sung by people who had every reason to give up, but who chose, against all odds, to keep going. The seeds of Germany's future were planted in the frozen ground of 1945. The Germans, as one historian wrote, needed a reminder that humanity had a future in peace, not in the violence of the inhuman war their country had started and lost. Christmas, even in its most broken and impoverished form, was that reminder. It was a declaration that life would go on. that families would endure, that love, even in the darkest of times, could not be extinguished. In the years that followed, Germany would slowly, painfully, begin to rebuild. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950s, would transform the ruins into a prosperous, modern nation. Christmas would once again become a time of abundance, of brightly lit markets, of children receiving new toys and families gathering for lavish feasts. But those who lived through Christmas 1945 never forgot. They never forgot the hunger, the cold, the fear. They never forgot the handmade dolls, the illegal Christmas trees, the single orange that represented hope. One man, now in his 80s, his voice still strong despite his age, remembers his Christmas as a 5-year-old boy in Hamburg. He says, "My father was missing, presumed dead in Russia. We lived in a cellar with 4 other families. There was no heat, no running water. We were always hungry. On Christmas Day, an American soldier came to our cellar. He was a big man with a kind face. He knelt down so he was at my level and he gave me an orange. I had never seen one before. I didn't even know what it was. The color, it was so bright, so impossibly bright in that gray world. The smell, it was like sunshine. I didn't eat it for a week. I just held it. I slept with it next to me. It was a piece of the sun. It was a promise that the world was not all gray, that somewhere, beyond the ruins, there was color and warmth and life. Every Christmas, to this day I am an old man now, but every Christmas, the first thing I place under the tree is an orange. To remember that soldier whose name I never knew. To remember that even in the darkest night, a single light, a single act of kindness can make all the difference, can save a life, can save a soul. What was under the tree in Germany in 1945? Very little, and yet, everything. There was the memory of a terrible past, a past that could never be erased or forgotten. There was the fear of an uncertain future, a future that seemed impossibly bleak. But there was also the ingenuity of a people with nothing, who created beauty and meaning out of scraps and ruins. There was the kindness of strangers who were once enemies, who chose compassion over vengeance. There was the resilience of the human spirit, the refusal to give up even when every rational reason said that hope was gone. And there was the enduring power of a single, simple idea, an idea that has sustained humanity through every dark age and every catastrophe. That even after the deepest darkness, light will return. That even after the most terrible winter, spring will come. And that peace on earth is not just a line in a song, not just a pretty sentiment to be sung once a year and then forgotten. It is the most precious gift of all. It is the gift that must be fought for, protected, and cherished. Because without it, there is no Christmas. There is no future. There is nothing.